You've probably heard the stories about NASA astronauts, heroes who braved the unimaginable and journeyed beyond Earth's atmosphere to face the vast, silent void of space. But what if those stories weren't the whole truth? What if they left out the parts that were too strange, too terrifying to explain? The horrifying things astronauts have said about their experiences aren't publicized, not in the way we're used to seeing. Sure, we hear about the camaraderie, the technical challenges, the breathtaking views of Earth from orbit, but buried in the silence are accounts of encounters that defy all logic. This title isn't an exaggeration, it's a warning. Over the years, I've come across fragments of information, whispers of events, leaked documents, and recordings that were never meant to see the light of day. These aren't conspiracy theories or wild speculations, they're first-hand accounts from people who were there, people trained to observe, measure, and report with precision, and yet, what they've described, what they've seen and heard, shakes the very foundations of what we think we know about the universe. When I first came across this information, I didn't want to believe it. I mean, who would? Astronauts are some of the most rational, level-headed people on Earth, or off it, but as I dug deeper, I started noticing a pattern. These weren't isolated incidents or one-off hallucinations caused by stress or fatigue. They were consistent, eerily similar, and most chillingly, they were being suppressed. Take the Apollo 11 mission, for instance, the one we celebrate as humanity's first steps on the moon. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins became legends for what they accomplished, but there's a less publicized part of their mission, a strange gap in the communications when the lunar module was on the surface. Officially, it's explained as a technical glitch. Unofficially, there are whispers of a private channel, a conversation where Armstrong allegedly described lights and objects on the horizon, watching them. Whether it's true or not, the idea that something or someone was there raises questions that are impossible to ignore. This isn't the kind of thing you'll find in a school textbook or a NASA press release. But when you start looking at the evidence, the fragments that have slipped through the cracks, it becomes harder to dismiss. These stories aren't just legends or campfire tales, they're part of a disturbing buried reality. A reality that, for the astronauts who've experienced it, is all too real. That's why the title matters. It's not just a sensational headline, it's an entry point into a world of secrets, a world where the edges of science and the unknown blur into something deeply unsettling. It wasn't long after I started digging into the recordings that I found something I couldn't explain away. One of the astronauts, his voice crackling with static, almost lost in the noise of the transmission, described what he called a shadow, though shadow wasn't quite the right word. He said it was there one moment and gone the next, flickering like a faulty image on an old TV screen. But when it came back, it wasn't in the same place. He spoke in fragments, his sentences clipped and panicked. It's moving, slowly, not like a person, not like anything I've seen. It's big, bigger than... The transmission cut out for several seconds before returning. When it did, his voice was sharper, frantic. It's closer now. Outside. God, it's right outside. The incident was written off as space debris catching the light, or perhaps an optical illusion caused by prolonged exposure to the vacuum of space. NASA's official report labeled it as fatigue-related misperception, a clinical phrase that felt like it was doing a lot of heavy lifting, but the astronaut's voice told a different story. You don't sound like that, like you're on the edge of losing your mind, because you've misinterpreted a piece of floating trash. The more I listened to the recordings, the harder it was to shake the sense that something wasn't adding up. The words these men used, the tone in their voices, the way they hesitated before describing what they saw, it all pointed to something much stranger than debris or reflections. I started noticing patterns too. Several of the astronauts reported unusual sounds, though they couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from. One described it as a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in his chest, almost like a pulse. Another said it sounded like distant chanting, though he couldn't make out any words. And then there was the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence you expect in space, where there's no air to carry sound. This was deeper, almost oppressive, as if the very fabric of the void was muffling everything. One astronaut described it as a dead zone, a place where even the hum of the spacecraft's systems seemed to fade away. It was like something was swallowing the noise, he said, like we were being watched. That phrase stuck with me, being watched. It came up more often than I was comfortable with. At first, I told myself it was paranoia, an understandable response to the isolation and sensory deprivation of space travel. But the way they described it didn't feel like paranoia. It felt precise, specific, as though they weren't just imagining it, they knew. One of the most chilling accounts came from a spacewalk mission. The astronaut was tasked with a routine inspection of the exterior, something he'd done dozens of times before. Everything was going fine until he noticed a glint of light in the distance. At first, he thought it was a star or a reflection, but then it moved. Not in a straight line like an orbiting satellite, but erratically, darting and stopping as if it were scanning the area. He described it as liquid metal, something that shimmered and changed shape as it moved. When he radioed back to the spacecraft, his voice was calm but tense. I don't know what I'm seeing. It's not a satellite. It's not debris. It's changing. Hold on. It's gone. Gone. That was a word that came up a lot too. These objects, whatever they were, didn't stick around long enough to be properly observed. They appeared, moved in ways that defied explanation, and then vanished without a trace. But this time, there was something left behind. When the astronaut returned to the airlock, his crewmates noticed scratches on his suit, long, jagged marks that shouldn't have been possible. The suit was designed to withstand micrometeoroids traveling at thousands of miles per hour, yet these scratches looked almost deliberate, like claw marks. NASA dismissed it as damage from a stray fragment of debris, though no one could explain how such a fragment could leave marks like that without compromising the integrity of the suit. The astronaut, however, wasn't convinced. He told one of his colleagues that he felt something during the spacewalk, a presence, a faint sensation of pressure against his chest, as though something had reached out and touched him. He didn't talk about it again after that. The testimonies began to blur together in my mind, each one adding another layer to the growing mystery. I read about astronauts who reported seeing lights moving beneath the surface of the moon, their patterns too precise to be natural. Others described moments of sudden, inexplicable dread, as though they'd stumbled into a place they weren't supposed to be. And then there were the whispers. Several astronauts mentioned hearing voices, not in their radios, but inside their helmets. The words were always faint, just beyond the edge of comprehension, spoken in a language that none of them could identify. One astronaut said it felt like the words were being beamed directly into his mind. It wasn't like hearing, he explained. It was like knowing, like the thoughts were being placed there, but they weren't mine. As I pieced together these accounts, I started to feel a growing unease, as though I were staring at a puzzle where the pieces didn't just fail to fit, they actively defied each other. These weren't just sightings or sounds or feelings. They were pieces of a larger phenomenon that seemed to operate outside the bounds of our understanding. The moment that truly unsettled me came from a recording that had been flagged as corrupted. Most of it was static, the kind of noise you'd expect from a malfunctioning transmission, but buried within it was a voice, a single phrase spoken in a tone that sent chills down my spine. "We are here." The words were clear, unmistakable, and yet no one on the crew reported saying them. They didn't match any of the astronauts' voices, nor did they align with any known interference patterns. It was as if the transmission had been hijacked by something, or someone, unseen. I wanted to stop there, to put the files away and convince myself it was all some elaborate misunderstanding. But I couldn't. The pieces didn't just suggest a story, they demanded one. And as much as I wanted to believe this was all just a series of coincidences, a part of me knew there was more to it, something bigger, something darker. The more I uncovered, the less I felt like I was in control of the narrative. It was as though the story itself was pulling me deeper, showing me glimpses of a truth I wasn't ready to face. And the deeper I went, the clearer it became that whatever was out there wasn't just watching, it was waiting. I thought I had a handle on the story by then, or at least as much of a handle as anyone could have when dealing with something so utterly beyond comprehension. The pieces were starting to fit together, or so I thought. The sightings, the sounds, the claw marks, it all painted a picture of something alien, something intelligent, observing us from the edges of our reach. But the deeper I went, the more the picture started to blur. What seemed like answers at first only raised more questions, and those questions pointed to something far more sinister. I began uncovering details that contradicted everything I thought I knew. One account, buried deep in a stack of heavily redacted mission logs, described an astronaut who returned from a routine mission in orbit and refused to speak for weeks. When he finally did, he told a friend in confidence that he had seen something while on a spacewalk, something massive and indistinct, hovering just out of reach. He said it didn't move like a ship or a living creature, but seemed to shift in and out of reality, like a mirage. What made his story different was the detail he added. As he watched, he felt something probing his mind, not as thoughts or whispers, but as pure emotion. It was curiosity, he told his friend. Not human curiosity, something colder, more calculating. It wasn't looking at me, it was through me, like I was the experiment. The file ended there. No follow-up, no investigation, just silence. I couldn't shake the implications of his words. If these things weren't just watching us, if they were studying us, what did that mean? And why hadn't we ever seen them before? Or had we? Another report, this one from a mission in the mid-2000s, described a series of environmental anomalies that started shortly after the crew entered orbit. The spacecraft's instruments began malfunctioning in ways the engineers on the ground couldn't explain. Temperatures fluctuated wildly, electrical systems shorted out despite no apparent damage, and several of the astronauts reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. One described it as a pressure in my chest, like I was being crushed by the weight of the void. What stood out in this report was the way the anomalies seemed to follow a pattern, as if they were responses to the crew's actions. At one point, the commander attempted to photograph a faint light moving outside the window, but as soon as he raised the camera, the light blinked out. Moments later, the ship's systems reset themselves, erasing several hours of recorded data. The engineers called it a glitch. The commander called it a warning. By this point, I was beginning to feel the weight of it all, the growing realization that these incidents weren't isolated, that they pointed to something deliberate, something with purpose. But whose purpose? And why? The theories I'd encountered so far only deepened my confusion. Some scientists suggested that the astronauts were experiencing psychological stress, their minds fabricating these phenomena to cope with the isolation and sensory deprivation of space. But that didn't explain the physical evidence, the scratches on the suits, the inexplicable system failures, the voices. Others, the conspiracy theorists, were convinced this was proof of extraterrestrial contact. They pointed to the similarities between the astronauts' descriptions and reports of UFO sightings on Earth, but even they couldn't explain why these beings, if that's what they were, would remain so elusive, leaving behind only fragments and whispers. And then there was the possibility I couldn't bring myself to entertain, that whatever this was, it wasn't extraterrestrial at all. What if it wasn't something from another world, but something older, something tied to us in ways we couldn't understand? The idea gnawed at the edges of my thoughts, but I wasn't ready to face it yet. The breaking point came when I found a series of photographs from a classified mission, one I hadn't been able to find much information about. The images were grainy, taken through a thick layer of reinforced glass, but they were clear enough to make out the shape of a massive, elongated object drifting in the distance. It was metallic, or at least it looked metallic, with a surface that seemed to ripple like water under sunlight. The photos had been labeled unidentified artifact and tucked away in a folder with no further context. What struck me most wasn't the object itself, but the captions scrawled in the margins of the accompanying report. Not natural. Not human. Do not approach. The last note sent a chill down my spine. It sees us. The mounting evidence began to take a toll on me. I started dreaming about the things I'd read and seen, about being alone in the void, watched by something I couldn't see or understand. The dreams were always the same: the oppressive silence, the cold, and the sense of something vast and ancient just beyond my reach. And always there was the hum, low and unrelenting, vibrating through my chest like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. One night, I woke up to find my laptop open, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. I could have sworn I'd shut it down before going to bed, but there it was, displaying the same report I'd been reading earlier, a transcript of an astronaut's final words before losing contact during a mission. They're here. They've always been here. We just never noticed. God, they're... The transmission ended abruptly, replaced by static. I sat there in the dark, staring at the screen, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The moment that truly broke me came later, when I found an unmarked recording buried in the archives. It wasn't labeled as a mission log or a debriefing, and the audio quality was worse than anything I'd heard so far, filled with static and distortion. But in the background, beneath the crackling noise, I heard something unmistakable. A voice. It didn't sound human. The words were garbled, layered over each other like a chorus of overlapping whispers, but one phrase emerged, clear and chilling. Do not return. I couldn't tell if it was a warning or a threat, but either way it left me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. These things, whatever they were, weren't just anomalies or figments of the astronaut's imagination. They were real, and they were trying to tell us something. The worst part was knowing that we hadn't listened. The deeper I went into the records, the harder it became to ignore the growing. Sensed that I was on the verge of something monumental, something that could change everything we thought we understood about our place in the universe. By this point, the threads I'd been pulling at weren't just unraveling a story. They were unraveling me. Each new account, each grainy photo and whispered transmission felt like a weight dragging me closer to some dark, inevitable truth. And then, I found the file that tied it all together. Or so I thought. It was an incident from a mission that was officially recorded as a success. The astronauts returned home safely, their data intact, their mission objectives completed. But the file included a series of unofficial entries, logs that had been kept off the books. These weren't written in the cool, detached tone of official reports. They were frantic, disjointed, and unmistakably human. One entry described a spacewalk to repair a malfunctioning piece of equipment. The astronaut, his name had been redacted, noticed something unusual almost immediately. He described a faint glow on the horizon, a soft, pulsating light that didn't match any known celestial body. At first, he thought it might be Earthshine reflecting off a piece of debris, but as he moved toward it, the light grew brighter and more defined. It was no longer a point, it was a shape. It's metallic, he said in the log, his words scrawled hastily and unevenly. Not solid, liquid almost, but it's holding a form, geometric, perfect lines, angles, too perfect. He radioed back to the spacecraft, describing the object as best he could, but the responses from his crewmates were cut off by static. As he got closer, the light began to shift. the geometric patterns dissolving and reforming like ripples on water. He described the sensation of being watched, though he couldn't explain how he knew. It was a feeling more than anything else, an awareness pressing against him from all sides, and then it moved. "It's coming toward me," he wrote. "Not fast, slow, deliberate. I'm sure, it knows I'm here." His log stopped abruptly after that, replaced by a terse entry from the mission commander. The entry was brief, almost clinical. "Subject returned to the airlock. Suit integrity compromised. Deep scratches present on the chest plate. Subject reports no memory of the event. Incident logged as equipment failure." But that wasn't the end of the story. Buried in the file was an audio recording, one that hadn't been transcribed. I almost didn't listen to it. Something about the way it was labeled, just a string of numbers, no description, made my stomach turn. But I hit play anyway, and I immediately wished I hadn't. The recording was filled with static, but beneath it I could hear the astronaut's voice. It was shaky, panicked, barely above a whisper. "It wasn't trying to kill me," he said. "It could have. I know it could have, but it didn't. It was..." He paused, his breath ragged. "It was studying me, watching, like I was some kind of specimen." The static grew louder, drowning out his words, but I thought I heard something else beneath it. A hum, low and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, or maybe a signal. The recording ended abruptly, and I sat there in silence, the weight of his words, pressing down on me, studying him, watching. What did that mean? What kind of intelligence could do something like that? Not just observe, but probe, analyze, and then leave without a trace. The logs didn't say what happened to the astronaut after the mission, but I found a later file that suggested he had been hospitalized for what NASA described as stress-related psychological symptoms. He never flew again. I couldn't shake the image of him floating in the void, alone and vulnerable, while something ancient and unknowable examined him like an insect under a magnifying glass. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about him. It wasn't even just about the astronauts. There was something larger at play, something that went beyond individual missions or sightings. The patterns I'd been seeing, the lights, the shadows, the voices, weren't random. They were coordinated, deliberate, and the implications were terrifying. What if these things weren't just watching us? What if they were preparing us for something? The thought sent a chill through me, but I couldn't let it go. I went back through the files, looking for anything I might have missed, and that's when I found the last piece of the puzzle, or at least what I thought was the last piece. It was another recording, this one from a mission I hadn't seen referenced anywhere else. The date was old, predating the Apollo program, and the voices on the tape were distorted, almost unrecognizable. At first, it seemed like a routine communication log, the kind of back-and-forth chatter you'd expect during a test flight, but then the tone shifted. One of the voices, a man, spoke in a hurried whisper. "It's here," he said. "I don't know how, but it's here, watching us." There was a pause, followed by a second voice, calmer, but no less unsettling. "It's not watching us. It's waiting." The recording ended there, and for a long time I just sat staring at the screen, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. Waiting for what? The question haunted me, but I knew I wasn't going to find the answer in those files. Whatever was out there, whatever these astronauts had seen and felt, it was bigger than anything I could comprehend, and it wasn't done with us. As I shut down my computer and turned off the lights, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by someone in the room, but by something far away, something I couldn't see or hear, but could feel, just on the edges of perception. It wasn't paranoia. It was the same feeling those astronauts had described, the sense that the silence wasn't just silence, it was something alive. I had hoped there would be answers at the end of my search, something definitive that could explain the fragments of terror and confusion I had unearthed, but what I found wasn't an answer at all. It was a truth so much larger and more incomprehensible than I could have imagined, something that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world, about space, about existence itself. The final piece came from a file that was never supposed to exist, one I'd stumbled upon by accident while trying to cross-reference mission logs with declassified government documents. It wasn't a report or a recording, but a set of directives labeled with an acronym I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was a code for a classified operation, but the wording made it clear this wasn't an operation at all. It was a contingency plan. The directives were chilling in their simplicity. The first one stated that any encounter with unidentified anomalies during space missions was to be immediately classified under the highest level of secrecy. The second directive detailed protocols for isolating and monitoring any astronauts who reported such encounters, citing psychological contamination as a potential risk. But it was the third directive that stopped me cold. Under no circumstances are anomalous entities to be engaged. Observation only. Do not provoke. Do not approach. The implications hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about science or exploration. It wasn't even about fear of the unknown. It was about survival. These directives weren't written as a precaution. They were written as a warning, as if whoever authored them already knew what we were dealing with and understood the risks far better than I ever could. The more I read, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The sightings, the sounds, the unexplained phenomena, they weren't random, they were deliberate. These entities, whatever they were, weren't just observing us. They were testing us, probing the edges of our understanding, gauging how we would react. And NASA knew. They had known for decades. I thought back to the astronaut who had said it wasn't trying to kill me, it was studying me. His words took on a new, more horrifying significance. If these entities were studying us, what were they looking for? And why had they chosen now, in the brief flicker of time that humanity has existed in the vast history of the universe, to make themselves known? I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being prepared for something, shaped and molded without our knowledge or consent. The thought was maddening, like standing on the edge of an abyss and feeling it stare back at you. For all our advancements, our technology, our ability to reach into the stars, we were still so small, so powerless in the face of whatever this was. But there was more. Hidden within the directives was a single line that stood out like a scream in the silence. Existence of anomalies predates human spaceflight. Historical accounts consistent with observed phenomena. The implications were staggering. This wasn't something new, something brought on by our ventures into space. These entities had been here long before us, long before we ever looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. I thought about ancient myths and legends, stories of gods and monsters that watched from above, and for the first time, I wondered if they weren't just stories after all. It was almost too much to process, but the files didn't stop there. Buried at the very end was a transcript of a conversation between two officials, their names redacted, but their urgency clear. "What happens if they escalate?" one of them asked. "We prepare," the other replied. "And if we can't?" The second voice hesitated before responding. "Then we pray they don't see us as a threat." I closed the file and sat in silence, the weight of their words sinking in. Pray they don't see us as a threat. It wasn't just fear I felt then, it was inevitability. These entities weren't just watching us, they were deciding what to do with us. The realization left me with more questions than answers. Why now? Why reveal themselves in such fleeting, enigmatic ways? Was it a warning, a test, or something else entirely? The ambiguity was maddening, but it was also a reminder of just how little we understood about the universe and our place in it. As I sat there trying to make sense of it all, I couldn't help but think about how much we've missed, how much we've ignored or explained away because it didn't fit into the neat little boxes we use to define reality. We've spent decades searching for signs of life beyond Earth, sending signals into the void and hoping for a reply, but maybe we've been asking the wrong questions. Maybe the signs were always there, not in the stars, but in the shadows just out of reach. The files confirmed what I already suspected. NASA wasn't just hiding the truth to avoid panic or protect their reputation. They were hiding it because the truth was too big, too terrifying to comprehend, and yet I couldn't help but wonder if hiding it was the worst thing they could have done. If these entities were testing us, didn't we deserve to know? Didn't we have a right to prepare ourselves for whatever came next? The final line in the directives echoed in my mind as I shut my laptop and stared into the darkness of my apartment. Do not provoke, do not approach. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of everything I had uncovered. We weren't alone, and we never had been. But the question that haunted me most wasn't whether we were alone. It was whether we were safe, because if these things had been here all along, if they had watched us rise from the dirt and reach into the heavens, what did that mean for our future? Were we a curiosity to them, something to be studied and catalogued, or were we a threat to be neutralized before we became too dangerous? I don't have the answers. Maybe I never will. But one thing is certain, we've spent so long looking outward, hoping to find life among the stars, that we've forgotten to look at what's been standing right behind us all along. And if they ever truly reveal themselves, if they ever decide to step out of the shadows, I don't think it will be to say hello. Hello, agents. Curious about the most famous and shocking UFO cases? My new ebook uncovers 51 encounters the government tried to hide. Find it in the pinned comment. And if you enjoyed these stories, make sure to subscribe, and there's another one waiting for you right here.